June 15, 1959, a boy named Richard Beasley came into the world in Washington, D.C. His mother, Carol, whose original family name remains unknown, found herself pregnant while still very young. Though she eventually married Richard's biological father, the union crumbled quickly. Soon after, Carol crossed paths with Jim Beasley. Carol was working as a secretary at a local high school, and Jim made his living behind the wheel of a truck. Their courtship moved fast, leading to marriage, and in time they welcomed 2 daughters. But Jim fell short of what any family deserved. Alcohol controlled him, gambling consumed him, jealousy defined him, and violence followed him, casting a shadow of dread over everyone in the house. Despite the chaos surrounding them, Carol did her best to plant seeds of faith and compassion in her children's hearts, hoping to offer them something to hold on to. By his teenage years, Richard had sharpened an ability to talk his way through almost anything. After graduating high school in 1976, he briefly served in the Navy, then enrolled in trade school to study machining, a skill that would eventually help him earn a living. Motorcycles became another passion, one that connected him to a young woman named Timothy Kern, who loved the speed and freedom of bike culture just as much as he did. But during this same period, Richard started drifting toward crime. In 1985, after stealing a motorcycle down in Texas, he found himself locked up, and his relationship with Tina fell apart. 4 years later, in 1989, he walked out on parole. At 30, Richard made his way back to Akron and reached out to Tina again. They married, built a life together, and in 1993, their daughter Tanya was born. In those early years, Richard appeared to be a hard-working man and a loving dad. Tanya cherished their trips to the mall, afternoons at the park, visits to the zoo, and quiet moments painting together. Tina had grown into a warm, devoted mother who wanted nothing more than to leave their wild past behind, especially the motorcycle scene and everything that came with it. Richard, though, felt differently, though he never said so out loud. He told Tina repeatedly that he'd turned his life around, that he was living honestly now. The truth was far uglier. Behind her back, Richard returned to a life of crime, dealing drugs, breaking into homes, and selling firearms to dangerous people. In the mid-1990s, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives arrested Richard. An Ohio judge handed him a 7-year federal sentence for robbery and weapons trafficking. A bureaucratic error spared him from extradition to Texas, where he was still technically on parole. Tina divorced him, and their daughter Tanya remained with her mother. Prison gave Richard's time to reflect, and he turned to his faith, insisting that God had been the only steady presence in his existence. Released in 2003, he returned to Akron determined to finally make real changes. He took a job driving a garbage truck and began volunteering as a chaplain at a local church, dedicating himself to preaching and helping those without homes. He felt drawn to people who had fallen, especially those battling addiction or haunted by past mistakes. Richard spent many hours volunteering at a soup kitchen, where he formed a deep bond with a boy named Brogan Rafferty. Brogan entered the world on December 24, 1994, the firstborn son of Yvette and Michael Rafferty, a couple who'd started their relationship young. They later had a daughter, and the family lived in a modest suburban home in Akron, though dysfunction ran through their household. Yvette's struggles with substance abuse deepened year after year. Michael worked grueling early shifts as a machinist, doing everything he could to keep the family afloat. But as Yvette withdrew further into her addiction, Brogan was left to fend for himself. He couldn't rely on his father either, since Michael's temper often led to physical discipline whenever Brogan misbehaved or disappointed him. So by the age of 8, Brogan began seeking comfort in Richard's presence. One day, when Yvette disappeared on another binge, Brogan, feeling helpless, turned to Richard for guidance. From that moment forward, Richard stepped into the role of protector and mentor in the boy's life. At first, Tanya felt jealous watching their bond grow, but eventually she understood that Brogan needed someone positive in his life. Then, in 2005, Richard suffered serious injuries in a work-related car accident, fracturing bones and damaging his head, neck, and spine. Doctors prescribed pain medication, and before long, addiction took hold. He kept this hidden, but the drugs changed him, making him irritable and quick to explode over trivial matters. Still, his reputation in the community remained untouched. In 2009, Richard used settlement money from his accident to open a halfway house for parolees and sex workers. Judges, attorneys, and prosecutors believed he was genuinely committed to rehabilitation. Richard became known for advocating for the accused and those fighting addiction, skillfully persuading judges to grant releases and place individuals under his care at the halfway house. There was something magnetic about Richard, a gift for making people believe him. During her freshman year of high school, Tanya wanted to follow in her father's footsteps and got involved with his charitable work, something Richard eagerly encouraged. Together, they raised significant sums of money. Around that time, Tanya entered her first romantic relationship with a troubled boy whose name was never revealed. He claimed he'd changed, and when Richard asked if her boyfriend would be interested in working at the halfway house, Tanya thought it might help him. But Richard's real plan was to use the boy to sell drugs in the neighborhood. While helping Richard clear his voicemail one day, Tanya stumbled upon a message from her boyfriend that revealed their secret operation. Heartbroken and feeling utterly betrayed, Tanya struggled to navigate even the simplest parts of her day. Walking through school hallways or talking to friends, trust became impossible. Her relationship with Richard shattered, and pulling away from the father she had once idolized caused her unbearable pain. Richard then shifted his focus more intensely to Brogan, who would do absolutely anything he asked. Brogan viewed Richard as the only person who had ever truly shown up for him during his troubled childhood. The gentle, kind boy Brogan once was had transformed into someone more aggressive and self-assured. Meanwhile, the halfway house had clearly become a front for illegal activity. Richard exploited the women staying there, keeping them hooked on drugs and forcing them into prostitution, while constantly threatening them. Eventually, the women reached their limit and went to the authorities. In December 2010, after police raided the house, officers found drug manufacturing chemicals, prescription medications, and other illegal substances. Richard was arrested on charges of drug trafficking and promoting prostitution. He'd also violated his parole again, facing the possibility of decades behind bars. In July 2011, Richard managed to post bail. His trial was scheduled for September, with a court appearance required in August. Desperate to avoid prison, he hatched a plan with Brogan to steal someone's identity, a plan that required murder. They prowled the streets of Akron and eventually found Ralph Geiger, a scruffy 59-year-old unemployed man living in a shelter, struggling to get back on his feet. Ralph's situation was particularly tragic because he'd once led a stable, law-abiding life. After finishing high school in the 1970s, he moved to California and worked his father's antique shop. When he returned to Ohio in the late 1990s, he launched his own remodeling and handyman business, achieving real success and even hiring employees. But by the early 2000s, the economic crisis and housing market collapse left him homeless. Ralph had no wife or children, but he shared a genuine friendship with Summer Raleigh, a 26-year-old woman who saw him as a father figure. Hoping to turn things around, Ralph regularly used library computers to search for work. That's where Richard approached him with an enticing offer: work caring for a cattle ranch and doing general maintenance. The job included a free 2-bedroom mobile home and steady pay. Viewing this as an incredible opportunity, Ralph accepted immediately. He told Summer the good news, though strangely, he never explained how he'd found such a perfect position. On August 8, 2011, Ralph called Summer to tell her he was heading to his new job. She wished him luck and asked him to stay in touch. That same day, he got into Richard's car with Brogan driving. About 90 minutes later, they stopped in a wooded area. Richard told Ralph to take a walk, and with Brogan standing nearby, he brutally murdered Ralph, then took his identification. Brogan was given the horrifying task of digging a grave to hide the body. On the drive back, Richard threatened Brogan with a knife, warning that if he ever spoke a word, his mother and sister would be hurt. The following week, Richard assumed Ralph's identity to secure housing and work. When he failed to show up for his August court date, a warrant was issued. Needing to vanish again, Richard moved to another location in mid-October, this time staying with a man named Joe, and asked to share his internet connection. Richard didn't abandon his previous hideout entirely, thinking it wise to keep two refuges. Recognizing the value of the internet but aware of his own limitations, he turned to Tanya for help. Using a fabricated story, Richard convinced his daughter to create an account on a classified ads website, and she agreed. Richard then posted the same job listing that had lured Ralph, using the alias Jack. The ad targeted a very specific demographic: single older men facing financial hardship. With the economy struggling and unemployment high, responses came quickly. In mid-October, Richard replied to an applicant named David Pauley. David, around 50 years old and from Norfolk, Virginia, was unemployed and had divorced in 2009. He had a son, and these circumstances left him feeling hopeless. He spent countless hours aimlessly browsing the internet with little direction. Not much is known about his family, except that he had a twin sister named Deborah. When David saw the advertisement, he thought it sounded too good to be true, but the offer tempted him. During their conversations, Richard mentioned he was a preacher. When David revealed he owned many belongings he needed to sell, Richard saw an even greater opportunity. They arranged to meet on October 23, 2011, in Marietta, Ohio. David excitedly shared the news with Deborah, feeling victorious about landing what he believed was an excellent job. He even told his sister it felt like a blessing from God. On October 22, 2011, David prepared to leave, calling Deborah and promising to stay in touch as much as possible given the remote location. Meanwhile, Richard and Brogan drove to the forest where Ralph was buried, and Brogan dug another grave. The next day, David met Richard and Brogan at a restaurant for breakfast. Afterward, they traveled to a remote area where Richard claimed his property was located. Once they arrived, Brogan excused himself to use the bathroom, leaving Richard alone with David. Taking advantage of a distracted moment, Richard pulled out a gun and shot him. David collapsed dead. After hearing the gunshots, Brogan rushed back and saw Richard searching David's pockets. Following Richard's orders, Brogan placed the body in the freshly dug grave. Pretending nothing unusual had happened, they returned to the restaurant in Marietta and took David's car along with his possessions, including tools and even Christmas decorations. They sold everything, making roughly $1,000. But Richard's addiction was expensive, and the money vanished within just 15 days. Desperate for cash again, Richard searched for another victim among the responses to his job ad. The next person to reply was Scott Davis, a 49-year-old man from South Carolina. Scott was single, and though he had gardening experience, he couldn't find work. The job appealed to him, especially since it would give him a chance to visit his mother in Ohio. During their conversations, Richard learned Scott owned a Harley-Davidson motorcycle and several work tools. They agreed to meet on Sunday, November 6, 2011. That day, Richard and Brogan waited at a restaurant where security cameras recorded their presence. When Scott arrived, he had breakfast with them, and they followed the same routine as before. As they neared the remote wooded area, Richard repeated his usual explanation, saying they needed to stop and collect equipment to fix the road leading to the farm. Deep in the woods, Richard told Scott they were lost and it was time to turn around. Sensing something was wrong, Scott turned to look around and immediately felt uneasy. The moment he finished turning, he saw Richard aiming a gun at him. Filled with terror, Scott instinctively began to run. Knowing escape was his only chance, he ran as fast as he could without looking back. Richard fired, striking Scott in the elbow. Scott fell, but before Richard could fire again, Scott stood up and, with blood pouring from his injured arm, kept running. Looking for safety, he slipped down a slick slope. As he regained his footing, another shot rang out, grazing his head, a terrifying reminder of how close he was to death. Another bullet flew past, narrowly missing. Scott's heart pounded harder than ever, but he kept running without hesitation. Breaking through thick brush, he stopped briefly, confused but aware that danger was still close. Meanwhile, Richard returned to the road, got back in the car with Brogan, and they began searching for Scott. Richard even told the young boy to run Scott over if they spotted him. Scott, however, chose differently. He decided to hide in a creek, believing it was safer than immediately seeking help. He stayed there for 7 hours, constantly listening for anything unusual. Afterward, he continued fleeing until he reached a house and knocked on the door. At first, the residents doubted his story, but his bloody, desperate condition convinced them to call emergency services. Responders were dispatched immediately. When they heard Scott's account, they were also skeptical, initially thinking it might have been a drug deal gone wrong. Additionally, there was no farm matching Scott's description. Fortunately, Scott was able to support his story by showing the classified aid he responded to and describing his attackers. He said the older man, approximately 51 or 52, had dark hair with some gray and used the name Jack. The younger individual was about 17 and very tall. Police released this information to the media, hoping for useful tips. Within hours, Scott's story caught the attention of local news outlets. During the investigation, police received an unexpected phone call from Deborah. She noticed striking similarities between Scott's experience and what her brother David had told her before leaving. Since she hadn't heard from him, an unsettling feeling made her believe her brother might also be a victim. Focusing their search on the wooded area where Scott had hidden, authorities discovered a blood trail and followed it to the attack scene. There they found a freshly dug but empty grave, concluding it had been meant for Scott and suspecting it wasn't the only one. Police withdrew to get tracking dogs, and when they returned, they searched thoroughly and located a second grave. Inside, they found David's lifeless body. Days later, while conducting another search for evidence connected to the two suspects Scott described, authorities uncovered a third grave containing Ralph's remains. At that point, the man's identity was still unknown. Lacking sufficient resources to continue alone, local law enforcement contacted the FBI. The FBI began by analyzing the classified AD and identifying two critical elements: the victim profile and the ad's writing style. They also started tracing the IP address of whoever posted it. Despite extensive media coverage and public warnings about the fraudulent ads, Richard still needed money and kept searching for new victims. Shockingly, even with widespread alerts about the scam, Timothy Kern fell for it. Timothy, 57, was a father of 3. After divorcing in 1997, he maintained a close bond with his family, often interacting on social media where they tagged each other in photos and videos. Because he shared so much online, his family was fully aware of his plans and activities. On November 10, 2011, Timothy posted on Facebook announcing he was leaving his old life behind and starting farm work near Cambridge, Ohio. He said goodbye to his ex-wife and children and packed his possessions. On the morning of November 13th, he sent one last message to one of his children. Knowing law enforcement was closing in, Richard changed his approach, which successfully kept authorities from catching him immediately. As a result, Timothy's meeting with the pair occurred at an abandoned shopping center. Once there, Richard carried out his familiar method. When Timothy was distracted, he fired the gun. Brogan then dug a grave and buried Timothy at the location. At the same time, the FBI attempt to trace the ad's IP address led them to a house in Akron. The homeowner, a man named Joe, said he'd rented a room to someone named Ralph, whom he described as friendly, but constantly using his computer. This information closely matched the suspect's profile. Joe willingly provided the man's phone number. Another investigative team obtained surveillance footage from the restaurant where Scott had met Richard. They discovered the individual they were searching for was indeed Richard. Even worse, he wasn't alone, but accompanied by a young man named Brogan. Using the surveillance footage along with the phone number Joe supplied, which was traced through GPS data, investigators pinpointed the main suspect's location. Remarkably, he was only a few blocks away. As Richard walked along the street, agents surrounded him. Without any dramatic chase or large-scale operation, he was taken into custody. A follow-up search of the two places he'd been staying uncovered more evidence, including documents and photographs. It was finally confirmed the second body belonged to Ralph. Shortly afterward, agents arrested Brogan at his home. Based on his statements, police located Timothy's body. Richard was charged with 25 offenses, including aggravated murder, robbery, kidnapping, and identity theft. Brogan was appointed an attorney, and a plea agreement was discussed on the condition he cooperate with investigators. However, he refused, viewing cooperation as betrayal of Richard, and rejected all plea offers. As a result, his trial began in October 2012. The Ohio jury, made up of 7 women and 5 men, deliberated for 20 hours. Brogan was found not guilty of the identity theft charge, but was convicted on all other counts. He was found guilty of 3 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The jury, acknowledged his young age, made their decision especially difficult. On November 13, 2012, Brogan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 70 years. In Richard Beasley's case, after the facts surrounding the murders of Ralph Geiger, David, and Timothy Kern were established, the jury found him guilty in March 2013 on 26 counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and aggravated robbery. They unanimously recommended he receive the death penalty. As a result, in April 2013, during the sentencing phase, Richard was sentenced to death. However, a procedural mistake during the first trial led to a review of the case in 2020, which reaffirmed the sentence. At present, while awaiting execution, Richard continues to maintain his innocence. His daughter, Tanya Beasley, has stated on several programs that she carried guilt for many years, believing she may have unknowingly assisted her father without realizing his crimes. Even so, she has worked to live her life as honorably as possible, and has even met with the son of one of the victims to express her support. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We post crime case videos every night. Until next time, stay sharp, stay vigilant.